Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks for joining again. I'm really stoked to be releasing this video with Corey Anton. And I'll take a moment and go through his bio and a little bit about who he is, set context. But first is some housekeeping. So as I've been announcing, since the coronavirus, we have moved, my company, the Circle Institute, has moved all of their offerings online. We are also starting a Art of Circling year-long program that will be online as well. So information about all of that below. We have open to the public events every week, and you can get information on the Facebook, which is down below on the website. And if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, please email me. My email is below as well. All right, so I'm really excited to have had this talk with Corey, and I think it'll be the one of many in the future, hopefully. I first was introduced to him on YouTube years ago, like back before YouTube was owned by Google, I think, where they only had like 10-minute slots that people could load videos inside of. And Corey was one of the first people that I ever saw that actually used YouTube in a way to talk about ideas, and in a way that we're doing right now. Corey was right at the beginning of all that, and he's quite accomplished. I'm going to go ahead and read his bio. Corey Anton is a professor of communication studies at Grand Valley State University and author of dozens of scholarly papers and book chapters. His research spans the fields of existential phenomenology, media ecology, semiotics, communicology, the philosophy of communication, and multidisciplinary communication theory. He's a two-time winner of the Media Ecology Association's Irving Goffman Award. Anton has received a Best Author Award in 2011, presented by the Philosophy of Communications Division of the National Communicative Association. Anton has also won numerous teaching awards, including GVSU's Few Teaching Excellence Award and the Graduate Student Association Outstanding Faculty Member Award. Past President of Media Ecology Association, past Chair of Semiotics and Communication Division of the National Communication Association, and past editor of the journal Exploration in Media Ecology. Anton is a fellow of the International Communication Institute, and he currently serves as vice president of the Institute of Semantics, of General Semantics. So, as you can see, he's very well educated. He teaches a lot, and the range of his interests span multiple fields. And the thing that has that my connection with him has really been his work with existential phenomenology, and specifically his real in-depth interest and understanding in communication and specifically media, and how phenomenology and media ecology, obviously in the age of the internet, is more pertinent than I think we can even understand. So we talk a lot about that. Some real interesting things about reading, real interesting things about we go really deep. I think really appreciate him as a thinker, and he's from listening to him and his videos on his YouTube channels all these years have opened up a lot of horizons for me, more than I think I can even totally understand. That's the nature of horizons. All right, enjoy. It's its own ecosystem, right? Um,
Oh yeah.
the thing that the thing I've been appreciating about these conversations, and what I'm seeing is that they're spurring on other conversations that are being viewed, right? And there's a way in which you can see this, each different conversations are being impregnated by other ones, so you really get this sense of a something something living or something being created. And by a lot of different people. Like, for example, there's Paul Vanderklay, who's a minister, right? Who's basically kind of taking on, like, really exploring all of these kind of secular ideas, right? While from the perspective of being a minister and really grappling with them, right? And having conversations. And it's kind of interesting because, if we look at, like, my understanding of Heidegger's notion about, like, technology is this kind of techno and framing, right? Chronic figure, like, get rid of all the background and only, like, look at the foreground. And this happens to be, and I think what you guys were doing back in the day on YouTube and what we're doing here is, I wonder if this is one of the places, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this. Where technology is actually affording, right, something untechnological to come in, right? So, like, I don't know anything less technological than a meandering, right, conversation that goes on for a long time, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, well, one thing is that they're finding that people actually have an attention span that they didn't know that they had, when it was just the networks, right? So it's like the networks just thought we were all kind of stupid, right? Like, you just got these little sound bites of things, because it was a different constraint as well. But you have people like Joe Rogan and that are doing these 3-hour long meandering, pretty deep,
Sure.
intellectually vast kinds of conversations, and people are actually tuning in.
Sure. Well, I think, what would I say about all this? Okay. I think, yeah, okay. Some of the podcast sort of stuff where it's available for people and people have longer commutes and they're doing it as a multitasking, and they may not only could they be doing different things while it's on in the background, and there's that going on. But I think you're right. I mean, there is some sense in which all of this stuff is elevating the overall expectations for kind of engagement. But I think as far as the Heidegger stuff, I guess my own sensibility would be that no, there really is something very insidious about the way that things are being inframed. And the way I would say it is that the technology is inframed by way of an ahistoricism. That if you take something like, let's take psychology just as an example. I think traditionally anyway, psychology was something like an experimental, and it's a body of knowledge, but it was built upon being familiar with certain thinkers and certain traditions. And you might say, well, in the psychoanalytic tradition, we're going to begin with Freud, and then we're going to try to look at how Jung reacted to Freud, and then we try to understand Lacan. Whereas now I think people say, we don't have time for all that. You point to something in the brain, and unless you can point to something in the brain, this is all a bunch of malarkey. So I think there's a kind of rampant ahistoricism that the technologies are introducing, partly because it's information overload. Right. I mean, I think when you look at people like Richard Lanham's work and people who've done work on economics of attention, there was a time when what was short, or what was sparse, or in need, was information, and we had more than enough attention, and we didn't know how to sort of get the information that we needed. Whereas now there's an absolute overflow of information, more than one could ever consume, and what's scarce is attention. So the information is now in abundance, the attention is scarce, and because of that, those two things coming together have, they've really unleashed a kind of rampant ahistoricism. And there's other factors as well. It has to do with diaspora in the culture, has to do with, changing ways that people are no longer in extended families, but just parents raising their kids rather than grandparents. I mean, I think that slows down some of the cultural change as well.
Right.
But mean, I think there really is an important issue that, you know, the STEM is coming back with a vengeance, and I think philosophers are increasingly going to be, and I think that, you know, to invoke Jordan Peterson is such a great example where, you know, people aren't really interested in philosophical ideas as much as they are in empirical based psychology. I mean, that's what Jordan Peterson brings, a lot of empirical based psychology to bear on his claims, everything from, you know, evolutionary biology, but psychology that's grounded in a lot of empirical studies.
Right.
And so I think classic philosophical ideas are giving way to technocratic thought, empirically driven, a kind of scientific thought. And maybe that's a good thing. I mean, maybe really, you know, important for people to be a lot more attuned to a scientific worldview. But that's how it's, I mean, I think for Heidegger's taste, this would have been a killing of philosophy and poetry.
Yeah.
Philosophy and poetry are in the offing right now.
Oh yeah, totally. Oh, totally. Well, that's one, I think one of the things that I'm, you know, when I've, to whatever degree I'm part of this, right? The thing I'm trying to see that I think I'm evoking or attempting to evoke is that sense of how do you call it, like that sense of the way, because right now I'm doing a series where I'm with another another philosopher. We're going through and we're reading the Platonic dialogues straight through, right? And then commenting on them and, you know, riffing on them and bringing different people in.
Great. That's great.
And there's that sense of where I feel they're personally indebted to, and I've heard you talk about this as well, of like what it is to really grapple with a text, right? And with an author. In this strange sense where I noticed that for me, because I don't have an academic background. I went to art school, you know, shortly after high school, but I got something spoke to me with Heidegger, and I used to, you know, as a poor student, but I used to live across the street from Barnes and Noble, so no one read the Heidegger book. So I'd go, you know, I basically had my own collection, and I'd go there, and I would just like get amped up on coffee and start reading Heidegger, and I had no idea even what Dasein was for, like, I don't know, the first 3 chapters or something, but there was this sense that something grabs your interest, like from some horizon opens up. And what's mysterious to me is, how do I know to be interested by something, which I find out years later, right?
Yeah.
As this whole world that opened up, but something captures me, but it's not something I know, like I can explain. And I think this is some of the danger that you're talking about with like the hyper scientism, right? That comes up where it's all the actual, right? We don't even notice that they're imposing a metaphysics on that, right?
Right.
In a lot of ways, but then from just grappling by myself, like trying to figure out what I'm actually reading, what was fascinating to me was at the same time I started reading Heidegger is when I started this practice called circling with a group of my friends in San Francisco. And I would like read Heidegger, and then I'd go and circle on the beach, right? We just get around and we just go into what was in the present moment, right? And we end up in all kinds of places, which ended up becoming like a practice that's actually like spread throughout the world, which is fascinating to to find myself inside of that. But it wasn't until about 3 years later, and I didn't know what the connection was between what I was reading and what I was doing. And then 3 years later, all of a sudden, I just kind of opened my eyes and I looked around, and I started to catch the like the grammatical structures of the way people talked, right? And there were things like backgrounds and foregrounds and worlds and getting someone's world and horizons that opened up, and I was like, oh, whoa, that it gave me a sense of that I had no idea that was bleeding over, that there was something about reading a text, right? And I would imagine this is the way with any kind of like text that's just beyond your ability to make sense of it, but there's something speaking to you, and so you read it. Like I would try to grasp Heidegger, and I would like have to step so far outside of my my frame of reference to kind of look back to try to attempt to understand that. And I do that over and over and over again. And what I didn't realize that was happening was that it transformed how I saw, how I listened, right? On some level that I didn't. And that's that sense of having a reading practice or grappling with things that are just outside of our own.
Yeah, I think this is a good example too. I mean, it's partly why I like, you know, I have the luxury. So I mean, I realize that it's, you know, not everyone has that, but you know, I'm a university professor, so I get to work with young people and I get to be in the classroom. And it's probably been why I've been less inclined to spend time on YouTube, partly because I do have other things to do with my time, and I prefer the face-to-face with students, and I really do prefer the text for some of those reasons you're saying. You know, I think when some young people, you know, think of anybody, right? When you're really young, you just run around and you play and you chase things and you're in the woods and you do this kind of stuff, and you have no idea what's going to happen when puberty sets in. All of a sudden, you start finding different things interesting and you start changing your orientations, and there's sort of newfound capacities in your body, all this kind of stuff. Yeah. And I think something similar happens to a lot of people around the age of 20, or in their mid-20s, they don't see it coming, but suddenly they go, you know what, I think I might be an intellectual. And they through a certain engagement with particular authors, particular texts, a sort of opening to history, and they say, wow, you know, I actually enjoy thinking. I enjoy these kind of exercise of my mind, of trying to figure out what an author means and the kind of distance that gives me to come back to myself. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's something so about that. And I guess I just want to real quickly sort of riff on that, which is, you know, when people are listening to us, if anyone would actually be listening to us right now, in listening, they're kind of allowing us to think their thoughts for them. That is, to really listen is to open to the other and let their words kind of do the thinking. Now, they could be objecting or agreeing or disagreeing and doing other sort of, I guess, dynamic relations of their own thought to it. But it's very different than reading. When I sit down to read, the only way for the author to gain a voice is for me to give the author the voice. That is, I have to engage in speech production in order for that author to be heard at all. So there's an exercise and a growth in articulacy. Like, one has to grow articulate in one's own speech production in order to accurately pronounce and to give voice to particular text. So I think there is a very real disadvantage as people just listen to podcasts, and as they plug in, they may be gaining information, but they may not be exercising the kind of speech production skills that come along just inherently with becoming a reader.
Oh, interesting. I've never quite made that connection or that next step, because I have noticed, and I think listening is perhaps the most determinate phenomena, right, of being human that gets very little airtime.
Well, I agree. It's so interesting. Is like, why are we able to listen to some people at certain points and hear what they have to say, and at other points we could try as much and to hear what they say, but we're unable to hear it. It is a fascinating. Listening, you know, is a skill, it's a competency, but there's something like there's blockers or developmental, you know, things where, you know, you get that Charlie Brown effect where the teacher's talking and you hear, wah, wah, wah. Even as you're listening, it's not there. You know, so there is something about, and I think you can see it in political discourse, you know, as people are listening, they hear selectively, and it takes great effort and real concerted attention to try to not just filter it into a tunnel and or a silo that's self-confirming for their ideologies and their, you know, the vulnerable ego needs to defend itself, you know.
Yeah, I think that would you say that sense of the vulnerable ego needing to defend themselves is probably one of the ways that we don't listen.
Exactly.
Right. Because you're right. Because I've noticed that sense too of where, and I want to go back to this thing you said about reading a text, right? Is like having to produce speech
Correct.
in some way is yours, but it's not yours. So it's really, I get this kind of kinesthetic sense about it as you're talking about it.
I mean, it's Merleau-Ponty, I basically become the other as I read them, because, you know, I'm sort of wearing the other, and I'm walking around in their symbolic universe, and then it's becoming, that is, I become myself through the other.
Right. Yeah. Huh. It's so interesting because I would imagine there's that sense of becoming another is you know, it's definitely seems to be different when I'm myself and I put myself in your position and I walk around. That's not really being you. It's like when I occupy your position so thoroughly that I begin to have the background that you have that allows me to see it differently as you would see it differently, right? On some level.
Right.
That
I
background
mean,
sense starts to get at levels of like identity and, um, but that I think, and I think what's on the horizon as we're talking is just that sense of a certain indebtedness I have to that practice of.
yeah, I mean, I think Figureground is a great way to come at it. Yeah, when you're first starting, the author is a figure and you're the ground, and that's the difficulty of assimilation, is that you're bringing your own ground. But as you assimilate, basically, you're not turning it into something that you're turning yourself into something that can match it. I mean, this is what Ross Ashley called the law of requisite variety. You know, that a system can only handle the complexity of the system that it would adapt to by being as complicated or as internally complexified. And so in encountering a text, I learn to internally complexify myself to be able to meet it. By the time I'm able to do that, it's become ground for me. And now I look with the author as a lens rather than me looking at the text.
Man, that's really quite deep. That's quite deep, and I think I'm getting the sense of, I think what Vervaeke would call participatory knowing, right? Of that sense and way, you know, the way to get at this that I've heard participatory knowing, the way that he talks about it, is it David Bentley Hart, the modern, he's like a continental theologian, and he's really taken on like the new atheists. He's really funny and arrogant and pompous in this kind of cool way, but he talks about, you know, so he writes these books and he's kind of arguing with like, you know, the new atheists, and he's responding to the claim that something about like that, arguing about whether or not Dawkins can test for whether or not there's a God, right? And he's like, well, okay, so here's what Dawkins would have to do, is he'd have to probably spend, you know, he'd have to go through all the rituals, right, for months, and he'd pray, and the ceremonies and the rites of everything that comes with the Christian world, and fully participate in it for a couple of years. And then we can start to get at that question. There's that sense where like in a certain way that you can't kind of in that, I think what he's talking about is that it's when it's that full Figureground immersion, right? An enactment of both what's foreground, but what goes background in order for you to enact with the foreground, that actually brings something like presence, right? The sense of being something like living and present. I'm just getting that sense as you're talking about, like, as we're talking about reading in some way. It's a deeper level of like, it's not just abstracting out and being informed, but you're actually like walking into another's world and finding yourself with a background that then you can converse with the author, right?
I mean, I remember when I had my colleague here, Robert Mayberry, when he was still alive, and I was in his office, and we would regularly meet and talk about books, and we would get readings together. And one day I was in his office, and I looked at him and I said, Robert, what exactly would your mind have been like had you not learned to read? And he just laughed out loud, and we both just sat there and went, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, the borders between brains may be something that's visible, but the borders between minds is not. Minds are much more of a socio-historical dynamic, and they have a lot to do with literacy, and that, you know, we've become the particular kinds of minds that we have through all kinds of technological mediations, clocks, calendars, but the literate word, I mean, the written word, the printed word, it has shaped our consciousness and opened us to history in ways that we would be in like a mythical time rather than a historical time. And look at like something like Flusser's work, you know, Willem Flusser, you know, he's done a lot of really interesting stuff on sort of the mythical and then the rise of the historic, and how right now historical consciousness is slowly going to be displaced by a new kind of myth. And it's the image culture, you know, I mean, image culture. I mean, and this, you know, it's also, you know, Lance Straight has some really good stuff on this where, you know, I think if there's a concern, it's that the articulate word, the thoughtful word is sort of being attacked on two sides. On one side, it's the image, and on the other side, it's the number. And so hyper quantitative rationality with everything being reducible to something that can be quantified and reasoned about in terms of a mathematical model, or it's something that you can just apprehend through an image. But the spoken word, the articulate word, is neither of those. And, you know, there's a depth to the spoken word that, again, it's not to deny that we can make representations by taking the spoken word and calling it the letters on the page. And it's not to deny that we can run all kinds of numbers about, you know, statistical normalities and linguistics and other kinds of things. But it's to say, isn't there something that's missing when we try to reduce it down to image and number? I think there is.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's like, it's kind of trying to read the text through like measuring the shape of the letter or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You know, and it's, I think, you know, one can embrace and talk about the importance, as I said, you know, the importance of, you know, I think some people, they need more statistical literacy. People, you know, they need basic competencies in math. They need basic competencies in statistical and scientific methodologies. But that said, I am, you know, I lament the loss of the humanities. And I think we could talk about the way that this is opening the humanities to larger platforms. It's bringing it outside of the academy. And I think that's true. I think, you know, it would be very easy to oversimplify all of this. I think it is very complicated on a lot of different levels. So it's probably more of everything in some way. There's probably more poetry, more history books, more philosophy books than ever before have been written. Like right now, they're coming off the shelf. So I mean, I think some of this, it all depends on how we're going to cast the narrative. But I think the sort of slow, steady, deep appreciation for historical thought, steeping in the tradition, I see that as on the decline. People just don't have time for that. And we live in a world where it's the electric media they've interlocked us in such a way that the rate and the pace of life is radically different than it was just like 25 years ago when I was in graduate school. It just didn't seem like right now, you know, we were talking, you know, this coronavirus, we're all in lockdown, and the universities, I mean, it's almost as if they're expecting us, not really, but it's almost as if they're expecting us within 2 days to go from all, you know, face-to-face instruction seamlessly to an online mode of delivery. And you want to go, a crisis and a pandemic is happening. Why can't we take a week off and just think about other things? Like, there's never going to be another snow day again. You know, when it used to be, when I went to school, on the day one, the professor would show up and they would hand out the syllabus and you would learn about the class and you would go get the readings after the class. Now they open the Blackboard site before the class even begins. There's homework assigned for that first day. Everything is moving at an interlocking rate and pace. Like even the coronavirus, how possibly would this have spread across the globe before mass air travel?
Yeah.
It would have taken years.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
I mean, it's the airplane and the logic of rapid, you know, let's go, you know, have a business meeting in New York and let's make it back to the end of the day. You know, again, you're going to jet out there in the morning and jet back at night. People, you know, I think many people, they're stressed, they're anxiety ridden. They don't know how to live at this inhuman pace. They're overscheduled.
Yeah.
And that information overload, again, that leads itself to a kind of ahistoricism, and it leads itself to a technocratic orientation of learning and knowledge itself. It's sort of like, what do I do with the knowledge? Like knowing and being knowledgeable, well, that sounds antiquated. Well, you're going to recite some poems by heart? How quaint. Whereas I think now we say, well, what do you do with that?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I would say it seems increasingly, basically what I'm hearing you say is like our sense of temporality is like just in the last 25 years is we're
Yes.
living in a very different temporality.
Yes.
And and it's funny, like, I mean, I'm starting to have thoughts for the first time of like, oh, this is what my parents used to say when they talked about like, there's no way that you can appreciate what you have as you're young, right? I remember going like, I wonder if I can or not, right? Like, and I'm starting to have some of those thoughts of like, oh, this is what they meant. They're right. There would be no way to be older when you're younger. Like older is a very full embodied thing. But the sense of what you're talking about, just in like 25 years, right? Within our generation, a radical change in what shows up as significant and real in such a drastic way, which a change like that used to take hundreds of years, right?
Yeah.
For it to happen.
I mean, in some way, it really began with the telegraph. The telegraph made possible a separation of information and transportation. It created the time zones, and it accelerated the ability to exchange information, created the futures market and the stock market. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of ways that since at least the 1850s, we've been living at a greater distance from people who lived historically. And now, as you say, like the last 25 with the digital age, as more and more people are living online, they don't have time for commutes. They don't have time for things that involve slow steeping. Instead, there's this demand for instantaneous. And I think that's partly the appeal of the podcast. I mean, the podcast is wonderful because you can do other things while you're listening.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now I'm wondering, right? Because this is what I've been, a lot of what I've been just diving into I mean, I just think Heidegger was so prophetic in this regard, right? About the whole thing about the age of technology and the concealing of concealment, right? The withdrawal of withdrawing. And that sense of my understanding is that like the deep humanities and kind of sitting with something and grappling with it and incubating it and being with things that you don't know, that aren't immediately useful or intelligible is all about in a certain sense being aware that something's concealed, right? But yet that being that glowing as almost virtuous to move towards, and that in order to know that, I must become someone who could, right? And drawing on that sense of development and character that comes through time and cultivation and challenge and grappling with things and dead ends. And it seems to me that like when you talked about, you use this phrase like living online. I mean, I really got that sense of like, you're not just talking about being on the computer, on the internet. There's a way in which the structure of the internet fashions the way that we drive down the road and what we choose to do and how we even think of our schedule. And right, there's a kind of like the online is now kind of on some senses synonymous with the world.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if you take things like relationships, you know, what's the impact of people swiping right or swiping left when they're determining how they're picking a relationship partner? You know, I think the difference between asking how good am I going to be in growing my own skills as a relationship partner, how much are my competencies, what is going to make or break this, is very different than how do I pick a good one out there. And I want to, you know, it's sort of like we act like if we had more information and we had greater ease, all of our relationship problems would go away. And there is something about compatibility. There is something about having a good match. Don't want to be ignorant there, but you can have a really good match. And if you don't know how to make the relationship work, if it's your own incompetence, the best partner in the world ain't going to help.
Yeah.
See, I think some people, they're underestimating how it's about their own growth. And instead we want a trick, we want a secret, or better, we think we're done, we're fine. Everyone else, all we need is more information or some accessible trick or some sort of secret.
Right. Right. And so that I just want to slow that part down and just kind of like zero in on a bit, because part of the thing that, like Heidegger, to go back to Heidegger, what he talked about is that the strange things about being in such, like, as he would say, a truly dark time is not one in which people are talking about how dark it is, right? A truly dark time is it's concealed. It's dark. It's dark that it's dark. It's dark and dark, right? So it's one of the ways that I noticed myself in trying to figure out, I don't know if it's figure out, but like trying to feel into what is the best way to respond to this time. That to me isn't totally obvious. But I think the hint I've gotten from Heidegger is when he talked about like in the danger is the saving power, right? And in that part of responding has to do with staying awake, I think, to the withdrawal of sense, or as he would say it, like the withdrawal of being, right? The being discloses itself now in its not being there. And that kind of continually noticing the utter uncanniness of this time. Like, so for example, like if you really kind of look, it's what's so strange is how not strange things occur to people. But when you step back, you're like, for example, the dating thing that you just brought up. In my lifetime, right? And this is a huge deal. It's kind of like how people couple. We've been doing that for like ever, right? It's been like probably the most central thing that human beings have done. And in a matter of about, I would say, I noticed this change happen probably within 2 to 3 years. When I was born, and I think we're the last generation like that have a memory before the internet, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I'm in my 50s. I remember when TV went off at night.
Yeah, totally. It's like, I just kind of lived my life, and there was a non-conceptual sense that what would happen is that you go out and you live your life, and somewhere in living your life you meet somebody, and most likely you'll get married and then you'll have kids, but it's all part of the enacting and living of your life. And that, I think, was probably that version in some form for, I don't know, thousands of years or something like that, right? To various degrees. To within 2 years, there's a whole separate category called like finding your partner, going to an app.
Yeah.
And this selectivity process where it's actually kind of situated in this its own category, and all this stuff about compatibility, where you show up into a relationship already inside of that context of evaluating, and that's within a few years that became the way that you date. People don't actually have a sense of who you partner with is just an outspringing of your life. It's now this thing that you do. And one of the things I liked you said a lot of really good things about this that have just really opened up. And by the way, I just want to thank you for your videos. Like,
not a problem.
Yeah, I mean, they really have served for me. Like, they served for me as opening up vistas and horizons that like, I didn't quite, it's like wiggled something free. And then, and then just my attention started moving towards it. And then that horizon has just yielded so many things that have really like had an impact on how I see and understand in, being in the world. I just really want to thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, if you want to, we can do an interview or, an interaction again, do a dialogue, if you want to chat more or sometime, that's no problem.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I mean, there's just so much that's going on in all of this. I think that, George Ritzner has a book called The McDonaldization of Society, which it's like in its fifth edition, something like that. But it's really good. I think it's some way we live in a fast food consumer orientation, and I think it's a dirty little truth that people don't want to admit, that not everything can be bought. I think capitalism wants to give it so that it wants to foster the impression that everything has a price, everything can be bought, but you're not going to be able to buy an understanding of either. You're not going to be able to buy a good relationship with a partner. There are certain things where it's going to be, taking seriously one's own growth, one's own self-discipline, ways of learning how to open to others, and to see that as a task. I guess this part that you were saying just earlier about how we go about mate selection. I think in some way it helps to look at other countries. Historically, women were basically kind of given away for property agreements and arrangements. There really wasn't very much option. And then like arranged marriages are a really interesting sort of model. And because I think in arranged marriages, sometimes people go, well, I hope they picked a good partner for me, but they learn how to make things work, and they see the obligation as to how to be a good partner, which is very different than when you're doing this romantic person to person, I'm going to go fall in love with whoever I want. Many traditional societies, that would be punishable by death.
Yeah, you're right.
You don't get to go fall in love with someone. That's rude. You have obligations to family and to the larger community. So, in some way we've created a society with a great amount of liberties, but I think it's very, in some ways socially irresponsible. I think, look at what's happening with this coronavirus. I think you're seeing right now the very beginning of some deep seeds of socialism being sown in, because there are some people walking around going, hey, look, I'm young, I'm healthy, I'm fine. What's the problem? And other people are going, well, that's fine, but you're putting vulnerable parts of the population at risk, and just a little bit of change of your behavior, just a little bit, could really make the difference between this being an absolute catastrophe with the hospitals being overfilled and something that's a little less damaging. But I think I think younger people, they're more aware, and I think they're kind of like, well, I think we should be more concerned about what's happening there for other people.
Yeah, totally. Well, this is what's, it's funny. It's you just brought me back to that sense of, you're right. Romantic love was like an invention of the,
yeah, for sure.
So that the sense of just that, what you're attracted to is innately going to be the good thing to do. It's usually, psychology will just let you know, it's like usually the person you're attracted to is the person that like is the person that won't love you in just the way that your parents didn't love you, so that you can then feel familiar and then try to finally get them to.
Yeah.
But that sense of arranged marriage is really, it's really interesting, because now that I'm married, and I'm in my second marriage, and it's real, and somehow I'm actually starting to really, really get it this time. Like,
oh, for sure. No, me too.
Like
I was married once, very young, for a very short time, and I've been with my wife now for like 20 years. And yeah, it's the world of difference between what I would call like someone who is best friend, and you wanted someone who is very companionate best friend, and you start to think in terms of how do you be a really great friend and a really good partner to someone, and you be honest with yourself about whether or not you're being selfish or you're not listening and all this kind of stuff. That is so much more helpful than going to try to pick someone who you think is going to make you look good or whatever. You know what I mean? I think people get married for the strangest of reasons.
Well, my experience of it, and it's funny because I feel like I'm definitely born of the secular humanist through and through, right? Like I just was of that culture. So like any social norms, like I was just kind of automatically suspect of. But I've actually kind of, through being married, it's really interesting. When I went into it, I was just like, well, it's it's a formality. Let's see, you do it for your parents or something like that, But actually, I feel very wedded, and what's interesting is I'm starting to feel that sense of like, that something's normative in the culture. That
Oh,
is
it's very real. When you're in a hospital and you really want to get a care for your partner, to say my partner or my boyfriend or my girlfriend, that doesn't do much. When you say my wife, you say my husband, people respond.
Yeah. Yes.
There's like, whoa, this is a legal thing here. This is a person who's going to have some legal action. If you say this is a friend, they're like, we don't recognize that. That's really not institutionally recognized bond.
Right. Well, what's wild is that sense of, oh, whoa, there's this almost like this third entity called the marriage. And oftentimes Brianne and I, my wife, we'll be talking and we'll get through something that we used to like years ago would like get into an argument about. And we'll get done and my wife will say, I think our relationship is more mature than us now.
No, that's
There is
great.
this sense of a respect for a structure that like is actually giving us, right?
I think that's very right, man. I teach interpersonal, and I try to convey to students that there's you and your partner, and then there's the relationship that you have, and that relationship, it does have a dynamic beyond either of your wills or your intentions, and you can do damage to the relationship. And even though both of you can try to get over it, the relationship has been damaged.
Yeah. That sense of literally being inside of something, right? Yes. Yeah, you're right. It has a Geist quality to it that kind of gives the two people.
For sure.
You're really, I think that's really true.
Trust and respect are so crucial. If you don't have trust and you don't have respect, I think that's the other thing I wanted to say a second ago about this in framing stuff. Yeah. So this was, I don't know, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was on a philosophy colloquium on a Sunday. It was a psychologist, a philosopher, and I was from the comm theory area. And we were all talking about artificial intelligence and the question of, is it desirable and how possible it is and all this kind of stuff. And in the flyer, it had the expression, faster, smarter, sexier, younger, and maybe immortal. Says, questions about AI and what will it have, all this kind of stuff. And we had quite a lovely discussion, but I think what came out of it is we sort of asked, what about wisdom in the information age? Like if we would have thrown wiser into that, would it have worked, or would it have just popped right out of the frame?
Yeah.
It seems as if we're going to say quicker and faster and more efficient, and does that fit with wiser? Yeah. I think people have a tendency to think that as they're going to get old, they're going to grow wise. And I think some people grow wise with age, but not everyone. I think if some people never have humility, they will never grow wise. That humility is one of the preconditions for wisdom. And that what happens is many people, they get humbled along the way to age. And there's the opportunities for wisdom occur there. Right. But I think there's a kind of non-humility or a kind of arrogance that's deep in the AI orientation that potentially limits people's ability to open to wisdom. And the number one for me is death acceptance. I've done so much stuff on death acceptance. I was on sabbatical last winter and I just finished my most recent book and I'm really excited. It's going to be coming out next year. Maybe even, it's called Nothing Exists, and it's on death acceptance, but it's on forms of absence and non-being, a little bit of Heidegger in there. But Jean-Paul Sartre, a lot of Douglas Harding headlessness stuff. I really like Harding stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of Shorin, Lynn Margulis and Doreen Sagan doing a lot of stuff on them. But I think, to me, accepting death is so important. I saw a Joe Rogan, and he was talking with, I think, Brian Greene, again, the physicist. And it was a great podcast. But at one point, Brian Greene asked Rogan, he says, if they could do like Kurzweil would like and do the neural net download into an artificial machine, would you do it? And Rogan says, well, no. He says, well, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I probably would have said yes. But now, I've done too many like serious psychedelics, particularly DMT. And he goes, I want to know what happens when the lights go out, And part of me wanted to go, very weird how you got from the question of would you do the neural net download to somehow you want to know what happens when the lights go out. Part of me wants to go, where's the death acceptance? Because I think what happens, and I think that there are people who undergo a serious psychedelic experience and then they experience ego death. And then after they've experienced a reality that's beyond their ego, it's easy to slide into there must be life after death. No, that was you alive having a psychedelic experience. I think many people who have serious psychedelic experiences, it lends them the ability to grow comfortable with death.
Yeah.
So it's like Rogan, I'm not saying he misidentified his own experience, but it's almost like instead of saying, I think the psychedelics have so tamed my fear of death that I'm willing to just see what happens. I'm not scared of it anymore. But instead, it was almost like he was imagining, he was trying to see if Brian Greene was going to bite on the might our brains be antennae, and it was kind of a strange moment. And I don't know, but I'm banking everything that I don't think anyone's ever going to find out what happens after you're dead. I think when you're dead, you're dead. That's the deal.
Yeah.
That's not pessimism or nihilism. It's beautiful. This is the Dasein. You are the opening of the world. You're the way the world's worlding. People are they don't know who they really are. They've covered over that, and now they're worried about the continuance of this little tiny sack of skin that they've taken themselves to believe. How tragic.
Yeah. So
it's just impoverished.
So what was it like? What was it like, the experience of writing? How long have you been writing this book?
Oh man, it's probably took notes of well over a decade, but I wrote it over the sabbatical. So I started writing last January, and I wrote most of it over the semester, then through the summer, and I had the chance to do some tightening up of it. And yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's going to be roughly, it'll be a trilogy. So it'll fit together with my selfhood and authenticity and the sources of significance. And those three will be, this will be my 7th book, but those three kind of hang together, my most sort of existentialist sort of pieces.
I could see that. I could really.
And I think, I did do a good number of videos on nothing that were, all my videos, they were unscripted. They're off the cuff. It's me in the morning. I'm there in a mood. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to talk about this, whatever. So they're really raw and they're unscripted. But I did do a lot of videos on nothing. And it was fun for me to then take the time to really carefully lay out my arguments on paper instead of this on the cuff here on the video, but to actually lay the stuff out. I feel very, very confident. Anybody wants to go on the nothingness stuff, I'm ready. I encourage them to read the book. Anyone who's
right in my back pocket.
Anyone's going to try to tell me that nothing doesn't exist, I'm going to accuse them immediately of not having read the book.
Yes.
Anyone's going to read it. At first, they're going to go, I don't buy it. They're going to get about 50 pages in and go, boy, this is tougher than I thought. 100 pages in, they're going to go, oh, my word, how could I have thought otherwise? And by the end, they're going, uncle, you're right. I give up. There's no way out. There's no way out of the nothingness stuff. And I think it's really Heidegger. I think for Heidegger, nothingness is on par with being. It's not a being. He's interested in the being of beings. The being of beings has to entertain the nothing. Right. As when he says the nothingness nuts, especially when you go to his essay on what is metaphysics. I have all kinds of examples. The book is just filled with examples to demonstrate it. But take something like this, Julius Caesar, he is a historical figure. But that means he had been alive, but he no longer is. That is, his non-being is part of how he is right now. Yeah. That's what he is. He had been. Think of insurance. Insurance basically works from the insurance providers having you pay for what might happen, but largely they make their money by it not happening. Right. An antique is an object who's here. We can see it, but the world into which it fits is gone. No, the human world's ancestor worship makes perfect sense in cultures everywhere because the human world is a world of absent presences. It's a world where we can talk about Julius Caesar. We can talk about, my dog who died, and she's not here anymore, but she's in pictures, she's in video. I can talk about her.
Yeah.
See, language is the house of being because language opens us up to all of those things that can only be through their non-being. That is through their absent presences. Yeah. History itself.
Yeah. kind of
Oh, I
ecstatic.
think the more that somebody really is going to be honest with themselves, there's no way out of the non-being problem.
Right.
I mean, we've inherited a Western tradition which tried to make it seem, and it partly was a religious tradition about sort of this being excluding non-being, but the world that we have is a temporal world. It's a world that was and will be, and the was and the will be are not.
Mm-hmm.
That's their being. I say it's not the present.
Yeah.
But it is the past. That's what it is.
I'm working through Nishitani's Religion and Nothingness. Have you?
Okay.
Yeah, that's he basically kind of stands, you could say, in something like what the Japanese refer to as like nothingness, right? Or emptiness in this deep sense, and then runs Western metaphysics through it from that, and like views it from that perspective. It turns everything on its head in this very foreign but rich kind of way. So for you, right? So what you're saying, right, is you're basically saying like, no, look, to say that like you can't escape the nothing problem, right, is basically saying that you can't escape your being, and that is really tied to the connection between nothingness and our death.
I guess what I would say, okay, no, that's right. And I would cut it more directly and the Heideggerian move here, which would be, in order to get at being, you're going to have to deal with time and thought. And time and thought are not a thing. They're not a thing.
Right.
Time is a kind of relation of past to present to future, but thought is that peculiar kind of time which inherently deals with non-being.
Yeah. Okay.
Thought is that kind of time that inherently deals with non-being. A thought that dealt only in actualities wouldn't be thought at all. And in the same way that thought and time largely resist scientific compositional analysis, a kind of reductive science, and you're going to have a much more complicated science in order to deal with problems of time and thought. You know, I think Terence Deacon's book, Incomplete Nature, is a great exemplar of some of this. But I think at that point, if people are going to admit that time is very nebulous and thought is very nebulous, well, then of course you're going to get the problem that nothing is going to be as equally nebulous as thought or as time. Yeah. If I say to you, is time real? People go, sure. If I go, is thought real? They go, sure. If I say, is nothing real? They go, what, have you gone crazy? You want to go, look, there's no way to have thought or time without non-being.
Yeah, totally.
You know, here's one of the examples in the book, right? So I'm there and I look and I see a wine glass on the table and I see a dog come over and the dog's tail is wagging back and forth around the glass. Now I can think about the possibility of that glass being spilled. So I move it away up on another shelf. The non-spilling never occurs empirically. So thought's ability to make the world orderly as it is, it covers over itself. That is, the world is the orderly place that it is because people avoid going where they know they're not welcome. This is the problem with the pandemic that's happening right now. There are many people going, if we act right now, people are going to think we overreacted because they're going to prevent the spread from happening. And then once it's prevented, those who thought they were overreacting, they'll go, look, you overreacted, it didn't spread. But no, their overreacting wasn't an overreaction. That's what made it not happen.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. I think Bohm talks about this, right, where
David Bohm
really does a really good job of dislodging thought from kind of internal representations, and he's saying that, look, we make this weird division between objects and thinking, but he's like, you know, that pillow, right? That pillow is accommodating a whole future of concerns that aren't here. That isn't an object out in the world over there. That is thinking. Like everything is movement.
David Bohm, he's great on all of this, on thought as a process, on thought being more like the weather and something below direct conscious control, at least more than we think so. I mean, we can try to consciously control our thought in the way we consciously control our breathing, but as soon as we forget to do it, it just picks up on its own autonomous cord, whether we want it to or not.
Yeah.
You know, you can have thoughts that, you know, we wouldn't ever want to claim responsibility for because they just spontaneously crop up there. And again, you see the ego function, which sort of identifying and disidentifying with the thoughts that crop up.
Right. And so kind of back to death, right? Right. So when you mean making peace with death, right? As like, I basically hear that is like the most important thing.
Yes, that's wisdom.
Yeah.
Wisdom begins with death acceptance.
Right.
With real humility about who you are.
Right. So when I accept death, I don't think what you're saying is like, I accept there's a line out there in the future that I'm going to cross, right? And when I've crossed it, you're not talking about the event of deceasing.
No, I'm not.
What?
I'm talking about a way of living, and it has to do with realizing that one's on loan to oneself, realizing that one's partly other people, that you're partly vegetative, that we're partly dreamless sleepers, that the opinion that we have of ourselves in conscious awaking life is illusory, and that I think people think there's this soul substance that is going to go on after their death post-mortem, and then that shapes how they live their lives. They think that in some way, if they commit horrible evils, they're the only one who's going to be punished in the afterlife or some weird thing. No, their horrors are horror shows on all of us, and we have to suffer from those things. And to realize that we're all in this together. I mean, this beautiful book by Alfonso Lingus called The Community of Those Who Have Nothing in Common. Look, there's one community. It's not age, it's not nationality, it's not even being human. It's that we're all dying and we're dying together. Either you accept that we're all dying, or you want to live in illusion. People want to believe in chosen people, or they want to believe in something like a salvation for them, rather than seeing it as the struggle for justice in this world.
Yeah.
I think people, they don't realize that, you know, if there isn't going to be real justice in this world, there isn't going to be justice.
Yeah. Yeah.
To imagine that, you know, Sky Daddy is going to make amends for all of it, right? And is going to assure that justice is. See, I think so many people psychologically, they know that this world is unjust. There are so much hardship, so much luck of the draw. And it is horrifying how much some people are born not only biologically with advantages, but socio-historically, wealth, all kinds of power. Other people biologically born with a disadvantaged body, a severely maybe disabled body, and also in socio-political. And I think once we accept that and get real about it, become adults about it, we got to do the best we can about trying to alleviate all of these world problems and not wait for some other factor to come and do it by either a miracle or by afterlife, whatever that is, some sort of everything's going to be fine, because no matter how bad it was, God's going to make sure they're going to have an easier time in heaven or some weird story like that.
Yeah. That's that sense of, so there's a sense of, so if I'm, because this is on some level, what we're talking about is closer to us than ourselves, right? It's like on one level, what you're talking about is the ontologically groundless ground of, like, before even our inauthenticities about death point to this nature of our own death, right? It's like you can't quite get out of it, but in that sense, it's so difficult to see, right? When you say death, so if I'm in death acceptance, right, and I'm living in death acceptance, what is one of the ways that I would know?
I think when you look at another's face and you see the other's face as the only possible God you could ever repay, you're in the right domain. I think if people say, well, you know, life is a gift, irrepayable, and I'm going to try to give it back to God, I don't think there's any way to repay God. The only way to repay it is to love your fellow human being, the earth, to take care of, you know, it could be, you know, better concern about animals. I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of horizons, but it's to realize the eternality of the now, it's the divinity in the details. It's not something elsewhere. It's about creating great art. It's about having wonderful conversations. It's about, spending your time as if it were your life and trying to have really high quality interactions. It's appreciating the fleetingness of all of this.
Yes. And this is what's really interesting. There's kind of this onto-trans-emanation thing that going on. I'm getting this sense of like in the immersion, in the immersing, and say in the face of the other, and like seeing the other as the last person I'll ever see, right? On some level, that's filled with finitude, but at the same time, it's interesting. It's like there's a going deep, but also transcending at the same time. Like both of those are happening at the same time. It's really a rich.
I mean, I guess I see it as, again, I think Douglas Harding's stuff on having no head is the most perfect complement to both Sartre's ontology and to Heidegger's, work on Dasein. It's, if instead of seeing myself as a sack of skin who just represents the world and the world is this object independent of me, instead if I see myself as I experience myself, that is, as the headless opening of the world, that is, the world makes room for itself by way of headless bodies. The world is worlding itself through my body, which naturally vanishes for the sake of the horizons. I did this video a while back called "You Are the Sunset," and I have a little bit of that on in the book. It's the sun is always setting and rising simultaneously. The planet's just rotating, but because of our finitude, because we have bodies, because we can turn west, the sunset appears as a phenomena. But the sunset isn't a phenomena independent of observers.
Yeah.
That is, some of the world's reality shows itself only with the help of bodies. Some of the greatest riches that you are things that can't be possessed.
One of the ways the world shows itself is with the help of bodies. I mean, I just really like the kinesthetic swish I get with that, like, because it dislodges the kind of the Cartesian, subject, and it's very, I think that's phenomenologically like really accurate, right?
You ever done the two-way looking exercise of Harding?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so like, when you look around and look at everyone else, they look like a figure against the ground. They have a whole body, head to toe. But when you look at your own body, like, you can see like your limbs and going down, but maybe you see the little dot in your nose, but you're headless, right? So he says to do this. What you do is you take your hand out in front of you and you take an index finger and you try to point to where you think your face should be. Now, using your finger as your basis, try to see what your finger's pointing to. And he says, if you do it, you'll see there's nothing there. It literally shows the nothing. But that's the nothing that makes room for everything. It's the original world womb. The world womb is the emptiness that's pouring in through your headlessness. And he recommends this two-way, to learn to do the two-way looking. So in one sense, once you learn to see the nothingness that you are, that is the nothingness that makes room for everything, then you do the two-way looking. You learn to look out at the world in terms of its particulars while also being complemented by the absolute emptiness. And what you find is that there is a total stillness. Like, try the experiment. Once you've really learned how to see the nothingness, walk through space and see what happens. Or like, have someone else drive and sit in the car. When you're in the car, you don't move. The stillness never moves. Yeah. It's unmoving. It's the landscape changes.
Yeah.
Even as you're walking, everything around you, the headlessness that you are is the absolute stillness. It's that which there is no witcher. And that's what every one of us, each of us is.
Yeah.
Each of it, he calls it, your capacity for world. When you were a baby, you were infinite, you were at large, you just were your world. And then slowly we all gave up on that by some socially agreed upon what we can see in the mirror. And we've learned to think about ourselves. And what we do is we covered it over in one direction and not sped it back the other way. So when I walk up to other people and I go like this, I'm looking at you right now and I say, oh, look, I can see your face. You have a head that's on top of your body. And then I go, you know what? I must be just like that. Where I should say, hey, I wonder if you're headless like I am. we resolve it in one direction and not the other.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. I'm thinking about like before mirrors, right, became a thing. God, that's such a weird. Because you're
Yeah.
right. When I
In
look at
oral
the mirror,
societies, before the mirror, other people decorate your face. You don't
right?
decorate your own face.
Yeah,
Your face is for other people. You'll
yeah.
never know if you have a beautiful or ugly face because it depends upon who's looking. See, this is part of that dynamic. I think if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we're not in full possession of ourselves. We're a social historical clearing of world that's partly constituted by others. Like I could take even something as intimate as my own name. I didn't name myself. Other people gave me that name, but I somehow growing up always knowing my name. So others so enter the recess of consciousness that it builds it from the inside out.
Interesting. Yeah. And even like, even the, even that which grants my, how I stand out, my first name, right, is given to me by someone else, right? Where my
Yeah.
last name connects me with the rest of everything. This kind of standing out,
Yeah.
which is such an odd thing.
I think going back to how does the death relate to the time and thought? I think one way to say it is we're walking straws. As we're straws who walk. We have a hole on one end and a hole on the other, and life pours through us. We're not objects. We're straws. We're alimentary canals, and the river of life is flowing through us. I mean, I think you're shedding skin on the outside and all the way on the inside as well. It's like a straw that sheds both its inner and outer layers as it moves.
Well, there's a whole kind, it's funny. I'm really getting this sense. It's interesting as I'm walking, as I'm walking into, on one level, what you're talking about is not, you're not talking about some new idea. This is actually phenomenologically more sound
Yeah,
than
The Absent Body by Drew Leader is one of the best books on this. The Absent Body by
the
Drew
absent
Leader.
body. Well, that kind of, I have noticed that when I meditate, that there's a, that especially sound, man, sound is something like the, how, when you, like when you make room for sound, like that sound is a whole other thing. This is one of the things this is one of the things that's interesting, that we're in a digital culture. I think a big part of it is because we've become so visual oriented, right? The It's hard to imagine, and I think you were the guy that got me into Walter Ong. Man,
Awesome.
that's talk about like Ong is, he's similar to Heidegger for me in that way, where you're reading it and all of a sudden the cube turns, right?
Yeah.
Where to grok what a moment was like in oral, but like pre-literate culture,
Yeah.
and
I
now.
think many people would really benefit from looking at his chapter called Writing Restructures Consciousness from the Orality and Literacy book. I mean, he's got a lot of books and a lot of stuff, but that chapter is quite a spike through the forehead of anyone who's never really thought about what literacy is and how it's affected consciousness. It's quite brilliant.
It's amazing. It's amazing. It's kind of like, I mean, even just the sense of just the sense that I can abstract out a sense of an autobiographical self, independent. Like I don't even know if that was possible until there was literacy,
Yeah.
right? Well, we definitely wouldn't have had the capacity to tolerate the novelty, right? Because so much was embedded into these rhythms and stuff like that, right?
Oral
But
noetics are very different. Yeah, I think the autobiographical and the narrative dynamics. I think some of that is Eric Havelock's book. The Muse Learns to Write is a really good book. Preface to Plato is another really great work on that.
right. So I think that one of the things, I mean, we can talk for a long time, but one of the things I was going to ask you about was, so you see this kind of, we'll call it like this kind of techno framing train, right? Just cruising by, so much to the point where, like, I've found out not that long ago that the current generation, for example, it it doesn't really have a notion of character, for example, right? Of this kind of sense of going through something difficult, right? And I see this a lot, and this is actually kind of how I think during this time why there's such a thing called circling that I do. I've learned it's as much points to the time that we're in as it does to the practice that I found, right? In that there are so many different ways, and this is one of the things I wanted to ask you about specifically, which is, I think the moment was actually the answering machine, right? Um, Before the answering machine, as far as I can tell, and I think the printing press and reading and newspapers and all that it's a different thing. But if I wanted to have an informational exchange, I always would have had to have called you, right, before the answering machine, like, and in that that kind of facing each other and talking and confronting otherness and all the ambiguity and the risk that comes with that, right? It's inherently uncomfortable,
Yeah.
right? But life was such a way that in order to do that, I had to go through that relational event with people. It was just embedded in everything that we did.
Yeah.
And then the answering machine, I think, was the beginning of it. And then email and texting, and all of a sudden you introduce this division, right? Where rather than having to call you up and go through this coordinated participatory thing, which in some level is what shaped my self-understanding, those interactions, right, are so crucial. Now there's all these divisions where people actually don't have to go through that coordinated activity. And so there's just this instant exchange to where in this generation, events are textual exchanges. People, like kids, get together and they'll text each other, or something comes on the text, and that's what's real, right? And the interactions, the embodied interactions. And so there's this kind of self-concealing sense about it. And I'm just curious, what is that? What's it doing that for? What's your sense of that? Like,
Well, I think there's a lot of things going on there. It's Alfred Schutz has a concept called growing older together, and he was one of the early phenomenologists, Husserlian phenomenologists, and he became instrumental to the social constructionist movement.
mm-hmm.
But, this notion of growing older together, he would say that there's a privileged kind of communication. It's where people co-share presence and they're able to grow older together. And what you've identified is a lot of asynchronous modes of communication, where somebody is at one place at one time and somebody else at another place and maybe at another time even. And that's the answering machines, or displaces that capacity to hold together. And I think that's one of the dynamics that's maybe there, and that it accelerates forms of narcissistic and or like individuated one side interaction rather than real dialogic interactive kind of sensibilities. It also, it feeds into, I think, senses of vulnerability management. I think people they're caught with without the practice and exercise of spontaneous interaction. It can feel, daunting to have to posse up resources right there on the fly when they get to, pause and think about what they're going to say if they're very used to texting. I think that the thing that I would really want to force there is it's changing the way that we think about what relationships are. So just as an example, I think some young people they're struggling with relationships because they think of relationships as this kind of ongoing act of exchanging information. Whereas, my wife and I, we can just sit there quietly, watching the sunset, doing really nothing, kind of just enjoying each other's company. And that is the relationship. I mean, that's part of its dynamic. Whereas if all of your exchanges are back and forth with texting, you start to think that's what a relationship is. Then you start to be interaction phobic because you don't know what to say. You're worried about, are you going to have material? And so they start to think about the relationship as this little tiny act of exchanging information, but it's this whole huge dynamic. And so I think they're stressed out about relationships because they don't know how to do them.
Yeah, totally. And here's the thing that's interesting to me is that ability to do relationships, right? To co-inhabit, right? In silence, right? That kind of dwelling together and dwelling in another and another indwelling you, and then we indwell us. That kind of deep participatory sense of things. just kind of to take it at that level and introduce a division where that becomes an option. Whereas before, because I think somebody came into one of my courses, and he in fact, I think he's from Michigan. His kids, his wife said, you know what? The Amazon rang the doorbell the other day, and I think he has, a 12 or 11-year-old or something, and the kid was so freaked out he wouldn't answer the door.
Yeah.
Right? It's interesting. In what the husband said, I thought was really astute. He said, look, it's always been terrifying. Like, to confront another person is a whole vat of snakes, right? Like, they don't even know that there's snakes that you're going to have to encounter in that, right? So it's like, it's wise to be terrified of a stranger, right?
Well, I think that's right. But I think, other dynamics that are filtering into this, though, is that they have, by the time they're 15 or 16, they have consumed in highly condensed form total relationships coming together and dissolving. I mean, they consume on the media these superly highly distilled representations of relationships, where it goes from the person being born to having children and all these complex relationships, and it all goes down in about a 2-hour thing, and they consume so many thousands of hours of that, and now they have expectations about the relationships, that they imagine that they're supposed to unfold like the happily ever after stories, or the kind of complexity. And then even they go on TV and they're going to watch like some sitcom. They're going to watch a show like that 70s show or whatever they're going to watch, right? Big Bang Theory or whatever they're watching. And they forget that those people are saying scripted lines. And then they look at their own life and they're like, well, I'm not witty and funny like most people are. And it's like, no, most people aren't that funny and aren't that witty. These are people who are giving scripted lines. This took a whole team to come up with this stuff, that these are actors who are saying. And so I think a lot of people have very unrealistic expectations about how to be a relationship partner, how to think, all this kind of stuff. I mean, you have to begin with some humble beginnings, and you work your way up, man. You got to have patience. The time's going to pass.
Right. And
if you avoid and you don't practice, you're never going to get good at it.
Totally. And one of the things that that's kind of eerie, right? And like kind of seeing the uncanniness of it is that so what? Like, for example, I don't have to go, I can just order my food on Amazon. I could literally, I think this is the first time in history where all you need is basically a computer, an internet connection, and maybe an apartment. And you could like start a company. You could become like epically famous, right? You can be on videos. You could be, and never have to ever come in contact with another person, right? There's just something about when I kind of step back from that and I just kind of sense the whole of it. Like, what is that sense? I mean, is it have to do with this kind of bubble that happened with literacy, right?
I mean, like one way to come at it would be something like this, and I should probably go soon. Maybe we can pick up this conversation, because this is going to like an endless conversation. But I think, it would be just Pandora's box here. But I mean, I think it's some way, the human being is that organism, that part of nature which specialized in non-specialization. Right. That was our specialty. That is, we don't have any particular ecological niche that we're embedded in. We have wide dietary practices. You ask, what is the mating ritual of the human? Well, it depends on what culture you go to. You can't just do, again, there's this huge wide and openness. And in some way, you might say that, it's almost as if nature experimented with opening up ranges of the experience of freedom and agency at a certain place and we're that. And in some way, you can see it, that this organism is not going to stop thrashing around until it figures out a way to hide or to get out of the agency that it's been sentenced to, and it wants to create a social determinism to make up for the loss of the biological determinism that most other organisms sort of like locked into, so that they don't have to experience conscience and choice and the agony of decision making. But there is that other extreme of those capacitated agencies through technologies. They afford greater control at the push of a button. And so you can sort of see in some way, this thrashing about in the free space in nature is trying to maximize its power and its reach and its range and its efficiency, while simultaneously trying to get out of it. And you can sort of imagine a kind of determinism and an agency wedding together in the strangest of ways.
Man.
You know what I mean?
Totally. I really like the way that you put that. I'm gonna be thinking about that. Those are all the kind of the thought, these open horizons that have just been kind of wiggling through as I walk around and just kind of.
Well, Guy, I mean, I really appreciate you contacting me and doing this. And let me know if you want to talk again sometime. That'd be really fun.
I'll send you some links to just some of the people I've been like that we've mentioned. And there was a book that you had mentioned, something about, what was it? The body. It's the body one. The
Absent Body by Drew Leader. Yeah, he's a medical doctor and a phenomenologist. It's very well written and really captures the difference between the body as cadaver or the body of another versus one's body, that one as it's lived. The lived body is Dasein. The lived body is the openness of being there and being here simultaneously.
Yes. Okay, great. It's been great having you here there.
Yeah, it's really been fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll be in contact.
Okay, you take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.